I remember the first night I felt it. The apartment seemed almost ordinary, quiet in the kind of way that made you notice the absence of sound more than its presence. The hum of the fridge, the distant traffic outside, and the faint whisper of air through the cracked window all blended into a soft, restless lull. I had just sat on the edge of my bed, tracing the patterns of shadows flickering across the walls, when a cold breeze brushed my arm. It was impossible, windows closed, doors shut, but the air was sharp, tasting faintly of iron. Then came the faint tap, and then another, rhythmical, deliberate. At first, I convinced myself it was the building settling, the pipes anything but what I was beginning to sense. A shadow flickered across the ceiling, moving against the flow of light. That's when I saw it, the corner of the room darkened unnaturally, like a pool of ink, and something shifted just beyond my vision. I never should have reached toward the light switch. The air in my apartment was always still this time of night, thick and quiet. The only light was the pale blue glow from the street lamp outside my window. It painted long, strange shadows across the living room floor. I was reading on the couch, or trying to. The words weren't sticking. There was a weight to the silence, a kind of hum you feel in your teeth. I set my book down. The leather cover was cool against my fingertips. I listened. The refrigerator wasn't running. No cars passed on the wet street below. Just that hum, a low, steady vibration in the bones of the building. Then a tap, a single, clear note from the kitchen, like a fingernail on a glass. Sharp, deliberate. My breath caught in my chest. I held it, my eyes fixed on the dark archway that led to the kitchen. Nothing moved. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. It was probably the old building, the pipes settling. It had to be the pipes. I let out a slow, quiet breath. The air felt cold on my skin. I tried to go back to my book, but the words were just shapes on the page. My attention was pulled toward the shadows on the wall. They were wrong. The shape of the lamp's shadow, it rippled, like a curtain stirred by a breeze. But the air was perfectly still. There was no breeze. I watched it, my heart a dull thud in my ears. The darkness along the wall seemed to breathe, to swell and recede. A slow black tide. I looked away toward the window. The glass was a dark mirror. I could see my own reflection, pale, wide-eyed, and behind me, the rippling wall. Another tap. This one was softer. A gentle knock from the same direction, not from a pipe. It came from the center of the kitchen, from the middle of the empty room. I stood up. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I didn't want to go into the kitchen, but I had to know. I had to see. I moved slowly, each step a small creak in the quiet. The hum grew louder as I approached the archway. It wasn't a sound you hear. It was a pressure, a feeling of something being full, too full. I stopped at the threshold. The kitchen was dark. The only light was the faint gray from the window over the sink. Everything was in its place. The clean countertops, the silent stove, the copper pot hanging from the rack. It was swinging, just slightly, back and forth. A soft, metallic whisper. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't been in here for hours. I reached for the light switch. My fingers found the cool, smooth plastic. I flipped it. Nothing happened. The room stayed dark. The overhead light didn't flicker, didn't try to come on. It was just dead. The pot continued its slow, lazy arc, swaying, and from its center came a final, soft tap, as if something had just brushed against it. I took a step back. My shoulder touched the doorframe. It was ice cold. I looked down. The shadow at my feet was moving, stretching. It peeled away from me, sliding across the linoleum floor. It slid up the far wall, twisting into a long, thin shape, a shape that didn't belong to anything in the room. It held still for a moment, a stain of deeper black in the darkness. Then it was gone. The pot stopped swinging. The hum faded away. The only pressure left was the one in my own ears. I stood there for a long time, just watching the empty dark, waiting for another sign. But the kitchen was silent. The apartment was silent. And the only thing left was the feeling that I was no longer alone in the quiet. The shed was always too cold, a deep, damp cold that clung to the skin. I was just looking for an old rake, something to clear the fallen leaves in the path. The autumn air was crisp outside, but in here it was still. That's when I saw it. Sitting on a dusty workbench in an old radio. Its wooden case was chipped. The fabric over the speaker was stained a dull yellow that I brushed the dust from its dials with my sleeve. The numbers were faded. A soft, almost pleasant scent of old wood and oil filled the air. I don't know why I turned it on. Maybe just to see if it still had life in it. The knob clicked with a satisfying firmness. For a moment, there was only silence, a hollow, empty silence. Then, a faint crackle. It was a warm sound, like a fire starting. The crackle settled into a low hum that it wasn't coming from a radio speaker. It seemed to be coming from the air around it, filling the small shed, vibrating in my chest. Beneath the hum, a whisper, too soft to make out the words, just a breath of a voice. I leaned closer. The wood of the bench felt rough under my palms. The whisper grew slightly clearer. It was a woman's voice. It sounded familiar, a forgotten lullaby. The specific one my mother used to sing, the one I hadn't thought of in 30 years. My breath caught in my throat. How could it know that? It was just static, just random noise. I told myself that. But the voice continued, soft and gentle and impossibly precise. Then it shifted. The lullaby faded away. The whisper grew colder, sharper. You broke the vase. A child's voice now, my own voice, a memory. Long buried, I was 7. I broke my mother's favorite vase and blamed the cat. I felt a hot flush of that old shame. The scent of the shed suddenly smelled like my grandmother's perfume. The radio wouldn't turn off. I twisted the knob. It clicked, but the whispering continued and I pulled the plug from the wall. The hum didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, overlapping that a teacher scolded me in 3rd grade a promise I made to a friend and broke. Every quiet, guilty thought I'd ever pushed down. They swirled around me in the dark. I stumbled back. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The radio just sat there dark, unplugged. Yet the voices continued. They weren't angry. They were just recounting, telling my own secrets back to me. I had to get out that I fumbled for the shed door. The cold metal handle felt like ice. I yanked it open and fell out into the evening air. I slammed the door shut behind me. Leaned against it, breathing hard. The rustling leaves sounded like hushed voices. And then I heard it. From inside the shed, through the thin wooden door, the low hum and a new whisper. It was my father's voice. The last thing he said to me, the single, quiet sentence I have never repeated to anyone. The hum softened. The whispering stopped. I stood there in the growing dark. The shed was silent again, but I knew it was just waiting, and it had so many more stories to tell. The air in the kitchen was perfectly still. It was a Tuesday, I think, late afternoon. The sun was already low, filling the room with a weak, pale light. I was just washing my hands at the sink. The water was almost too hot. Steam fogged the window above the tap. I watched it cloud over, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and green. I turned the water off. The only sound was the drip from the faucet and the low hum of the refrigerator. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, dot on the countertop. The small ceramic vase. It was just a simple white thing, meant for a single flower. It sat on the dark granite. Empty, it slid, just an inch out of soft, scraping whisper. I froze that my hand, still wet and cold. I stared at the spot where had been the my mind scrambling for a reason, a vibration from a truck. The house settling. But the street outside was silent. The house was holding its breath. I took a step closer. My sock feet made no noise on the floor. The granite felt cool through my socks. I looked at the vase, just a normal vase. Then I saw my reflection in the toaster. Stretched, my face was long and thin. My eyes were just dark pits. It was me, but it wasn't. I looked up at the window. The one I had fogged was steamed at my reflection. That was wrong too. My body was too tall. My arms seemed to sway, like a strand of seaweed in a deep current. A chill brushed the back of my neck. It wasn't a draft. It was a presence, a cold spot in the still, warm air. The fine hairs on my arms stood up. I forced myself to look away from the warped glass. Back to the vase. It slid again. This time it was a clear, deliberate movement, a smooth, 6-inch glide across the polished stone. There was no force that could have caused it, and no one else in the room. The sound was like grit on glass at a dry, hushed noise that filled the silence. IT stopped exactly in the center of the counter. As if it found its intended place. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't seem to pull in enough air. The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to lean in. The pale light from the window grew dimmer. I looked at the vase, and I knew it was going to move once more. I didn't want to see it. But I couldn't look away. MY feet were rooted to the spot. The deep, cold weight settled in my stomach. The reflection in the toaster shifted. MY elongated face seemed to twist. The dark pits of its eyes looked back at me. The vase began to turn slowly. IT rotated on its base, a perfect silent pivot, until the simple painted blue band on its side was facing me, not a single unblinking eye. Then it was still. The chill in the room deepened. Seeping into my skin, the hum of the refrigerator had stopped. The drip from a faucet was gone. There was only a perfect, ringing silence. And the vase, sitting in the middle of the counter, facing me. I finally managed to take a step back. The floorboard creaked. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. The vase did not move again. I stood there for a long time, just watching it, waiting. The pale light faded into dusk. Shadows pooled in the corners of the kitchen, stretching across the floor. The vase remained a silent sentinel in the growing dark, to the small, white object that had rewritten the rules of my world. I left the kitchen eventually. I walked backwards, MY eyes locked on it, until the doorframe hid it from view. I can still feel the chill it left behind at a permanent winter in that one room. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, I think I can hear it. The faint, dry whisper ceramic on stone, still moving. Somewhere in the dark, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a blanket made of dust and old air. I had just turned out the lamp. The room was swallowed by the dark. Only a sliver of moonlight cut across the floor. It was pale, cold. I pulled the comforter up to my chin. The fabric was soft against my skin. I could smell the faint scent of laundry detergent. And something else underneath. Something stale, like old wood. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and then I heard it. A soft, groaning whisper from across the room. My eyes opened. The bedroom door was closed. I had shut it myself. I always shut it. But now it was moving. It was opening. Just a crack at first. A black slit in the darker wall. The groan was long and low. The sound of a tired, old bone. I held my breath. The air in the room grew still. Colder. I could feel the chill on my face. The door kept moving. It swung inward. Slowly. So slowly. It was halfway open now. A void of deeper blackness waiting in the hall. And that's when I saw the shadows. They weren't just the absence of light. They were something else. They coiled along the edges of the doorframe, like thick black smoke. They slithered up the wood, dripped down onto the floor. They moved with a purpose. A slow, liquid crawl. One tendril reached across the threshold. It slid over the wooden floorboards. No sound, just a smooth, dark flow. My heart was a dull hammer in my chest. My fingers clenched the blanket. The fabric was no longer soft. It felt rough, suffocating. The shadows kept coming. They pooled on the floor, a dark stain spreading toward the bed. The moonlight seemed to shy away from it, retreating. The pale light on the floor grew dimmer. The room was filling with a soft, rustling silence. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears. It was a sound you felt in your bones. A dry, papery whisper against the mind. The dark pool reached the edge of the rug. It didn't stop. It flowed over the woven wool. The colors underneath seemed to die. I wanted to move, to sit up, to scream, but my body was stone. I was pinned to the mattress. I could only watch. The coiling shadows began to rise from the floor. They gathered in the space at the foot of my bed, taking shape. No clear form, just a shifting, breathing darkness, taller than a man. It had no eyes, but I knew it was looking at me. The rustling grew louder inside my head. It wasn't a language. It was a feeling of being known, seen, every forgotten shame, every secret fear. It saw them all. The shape leaned forward. It didn't bend. It just flowed closer. The cold intensified. It was a deep marrow cold. I could see my own breath now. A faint puff of white in the dead air. The shadow was right there, at the foot of the bed. I could smell it. Damp earth, decayed leaves, the scent of forest floor, deep and forgotten. It reached for me, a limb of pure night. Slow, inexorable. I squeezed my eyes shut. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. Not with a scream, but with a whisper, a silence. I waited. The cold touched my shin through the blanket. A gentle, icy pressure. And then it was gone. The pressure vanished. The cold began to recede. I forced my eyes open. The room was empty. The door was closed, just as I had left it. The moonlight lay in a clean, pale strip on the floor. No shadows, no coiling darkness. My heart slowed its frantic beat. The air felt light again. I took a shaky breath. It was just a dream, a bad dream. I let my head sink back into the pillow. My body relaxed, and then I saw it, on the white duvet, right at the foot of the bed. A single dark smudge, like ash or soot. I stared at it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. From the other side of the closed door, a soft, rustling sigh. The air in my grandmother's house was always still, thick with the smell of old books and dust that I was alone there for weekend. The silence felt heavy to a blanket I had to push through. It started on the second night. I was reading in the living room that a single lamp cast a warm, yellow pool on the wall. That's when I saw it, a long, dark shadow stretching behind the bookshelf. It didn't belong there. I held my breath. The shadow twitched. IT wasn't a flicker of the lamp. IT was a slow, deliberate curl, like a finger beckoning. Then it smoothed out again, just a shadow on the wall. I turned back to my book. But the words were just shapes, and my whole attention was fixed on the edge of my vision on that patch of wall. A low hum began to fill the room. IT wasn't the AR. IT was inside my head, a faint electric static. The shadow shifted again. This time it stretched, lengthening until it touched the ceiling. IT swayed gently to a dark ribbon in the pale light. And with each gentle swing, I heard it a soft, dry rustle, like feet shuffling through dead leaves. My skin felt cold, and my fingers were numb on the page. This wasn't right. Shadows don't move on their own. They don't make a sound. I stood up and my joints felt stiff. The static hum grew louder, filling my ears. The shadow on the wall pulsed. IT split into two distinct forms, tall and thin. They looked like people, standing side by side. Their edges were fuzzy, blurred by the static. They began to walk at a slow, graceful glide along the flower-patterned wallpaper. And with every step they took, I heard it, the quiet, distinct crunch of a footstep, not on the wooden floor, but right beside my ear. I took a step toward the wall. The shadows stopped. They turned point to featureless. Dark faces looked back at me. There was no anger there and no malice, just a deep, empty curiosity. One of them raised a slender AR. M.IT pointed. Not at me, but at the empty space behind me. The static hum shifted, pitched it. IT became a whisper. I couldn't quite understand a voice made of rust and dust. I was too afraid to turn around, too afraid to see what was pointing at. I just stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, that a prisoner between the shadows on the wall and the unseen thing at my back. Then, as suddenly as it began, the hum faded. The static receded from my mind, leaving a hollow silence behind. The two shadows on the wall softened. They bled together, then faded back into a single, ordinary stain of darkness. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The air was still again. The only smell was dust. I slowly turned my head. There was nothing behind me, just the empty archway leading into the hall. I sat back down, picked up my book that my hands were trembling. I didn't read. I just watched the wall, waiting for the shadows to remember how to move, listening for the whisper of a footstep that wasn't there. The air in my bedroom was still, thick with the warmth of summer night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint scent of dust and old would fill my lungs with every breath. That's when I first heard it, a whisper. Not from the door, or the window, but from directly above me. It was softer than a breath, a thread of sound. Woven into the silence, I held my own breath, my fingers clutching the cotton sheet. The whisper came again, a wordless, rustling murmur. like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I slowly sat up. The old floorboards under my bed were silent. MY eyes were fixed on the white, textured ceiling. IT was a map of faint shadows in the pale moonlight. I saw nothing, just the familiar patterns of stucco. Then the whisper came a third time that IT was closer now that I asked if the speaker was just on the other side of the plaster. A gentle, pulsing hum seemed to live inside the sound, a low, electrical thrum I could feel in my teeth. I swung my legs out of bed. The wooden floor was cool beneath my bare feet, and I didn't turn on a lamp. The moon provided a dim, silver guide as I stood on the mattress, my head tilted back. The whisper stopped. The hum faded into a deep, waiting silence. I reached a hand up them while fingertips brushed against the ceiling. IT felt cold. Unexpectedly cold, like a slab of stone. A sudden, sharp whisper erupted right where my fingers touched. I snatched my hand back. MY heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I stepped down. MY legs felt unsteady. I needed to see. I needed a different angle. I moved to the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. I pressed my back against the cool wall, and I looked up again. The shadows on the ceiling were changing. The ordinary, jagged patterns of the stucco began to smooth out. They darkened. They stretched, lengthening like spilled ink, forming a long, slender shape directly over my bead. IT looked like the shadow of a person, lying down. I couldn't blink. I couldn't look away. The hum returned, a gentle vibration in the air, and with it, the whispering. IT wasn't random anymore. IT was a rhythm that a soft, repeating cadence that IT sounded like shushing. The shadow above my bed began to retract, pulling it on itself, slowly, until it was just a dark, human-shaped stain on the white ceiling. The whispering grew a little louder, a little clearer. IT was a woman's voice, faint and full of static. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. IT was a lullaby. My throat felt tight. MY own childhood room flashed in my mind, a nightlight, that a stuffed bear, a song sung softly in the dark. This was that same song, the one I had forgotten for 30 years. The hum pulsed in time with the melody. The shadow on the ceiling did not move. IT just lay there, a permanent silhouette, listening to its own whispered song. I slid down the wall to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The lullaby continued a loop of gentle, static-filled comfort. IT was a sound that should have been soothing, but it filled me with a cold, bottomless dread. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the shadow, listening to the whisper from above. The room grew colder. The scent of dust was now joined by something else, the faint, sweet smell of old perfume. Eventually, the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window. The shadow on the ceiling started to fade. The whispered lullaby grew softer. The gentle hum receded back into the walls. By the time the sun properly rose, the ceiling was white and plain again, silent. I stood up. MY body was stiff. MY eyes burned from lack of sleep. I looked at my bed. I knew I would never sleep in it again, because now I understood. The whisper wasn't a threat. IT was an invitation to a call from someone that had been sleeping up there for a very, very long time. And last night, I had finally been quiet enough to hear it. The rain had been falling for 3 days. A steady, gray drumming against the roof of my old house. I was reading in the living room, wrapped in a blanket. The only light was a single lamp, casting a warm, small circle on the pages. Everything else was swallowed by the deep blue of the late hour. I turned a page, and I felt it, a subtle vibration through the worn fabric of the armchair, a faint hum in my teeth. I thought it was a furnace kicking on, but the house was silent, too silent. The usual creaks and sighs of the old wood had all stopped, held their breath. I looked up from my book, down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The air there was different, thicker. At the very end, just where the shadows bled into absolute black, a shape stood. It was just a silhouette, taller than a man and unnaturally still. It had no details, no face, no features, just a cutout of a deeper darkness. My first thought wasn't fear. It was a dull, distant curiosity. Who or what was standing in my hall? I slowly closed my book. The soft thump of the cover seemed deafening. I didn't call out. Something in the absolute stillness of the figure told me it wouldn't answer. As I watched, The framed photograph on the wall beside my chair began to tremble. A faint, glassy buzzing. The pens on the coffee table shivered, rolling in tiny, nervous circles. The vibration was coming from it, from the figure, a low, resonant frequency that made the air feel heavy. I stood up. My legs felt unsteady. The floorboards were humming under my bare feet. I took one step toward the hallway. The figure didn't move. It didn't react at all, but the vibrations intensified. The lamp on the side table flickered, the light guttering for a heart-stopping moment. In that pulse of near darkness, I saw it clearly. It was still there, waiting. I took another step. The air grew cold. A winter chill that seeped through my sweater. I could see my own breath now. Little white puffs in the lamplight. The silhouette remained. A silent sentinel at the end of my world. My curiosity was curdling, twisting into a cold knot in my stomach. This wasn't a visitor. This was a presence. It had always been here. I was just now being allowed to see it. The vibrations traveled up my spine. A constant, unsettling tremor. The windows in the living room rattled softly in their frames. A high, thin whine began to sound in my ears. Or was it coming from the hall? I couldn't tell anymore. I was 5 steps from the hallway entrance. The darkness there seemed to pulse. It was drinking the light from the room. The figure appeared to be growing. Taller, thinner. Its edges bled into the shadows, becoming part of the wall, part of the air. I could feel its attention on me. A weightless, pressureless focus. It was aware of me. It had always been aware. I stopped at the threshold, my hand resting on the cool wood of the doorframe. I could go no further. The silence in the house was absolute again. The vibration ceased. The humming stopped. The photograph on the wall went still. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. And in that sudden, profound quiet, the figure took a single, soft step forward. No rustle of clothing. No whisper of movement. Just a shift in the darkness. It was closer now. Close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from it. A dry, ancient cold. I took a step back. My breath caught in my throat. The figure did not advance. It simply stood. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the lamp steadied. The room warmed by a single degree. The silhouette began to recede, not by moving away, but by fading. The darkness it was made of unraveled, dissolving back into the ordinary shadows of the hallway. Within a few seconds, there was nothing there, just an empty hall. The familiar sight of my closed bedroom door. The rain continued its gentle patter outside. I stood there for a long time, my feet rooted to the floor, the memory of the cold still clinging to my skin. The house was just a house again, but I knew it was never just a house. The hall is empty now, but sometimes, in the very corner of my eye, I see the shadows twitch, and I feel a faint, familiar hum start deep in my bones. The air in the study was still, thick with the smell of old books and dust. IT was late. The only light came from a pale yellow lamp on my desk. Its glow barely reached the corners of the room, but I was just sitting there, staring at nothing, at the empty space in the middle of the oak table. Then it happened, not suddenly, but softly. A key, the old brass one for the shed. IT was just there, hovering. About a foot above the wood, IT was turning so slowly as if moved by a gentle, unseen current. My breath caught in my chest at a cold knot tightened in my stomach, that I didn't move that I couldn't. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. I just watched it spin at a dull glint of brass in a weak light. There was no string and no trick, just a key and the silence. That's when I noticed the shadows. They were wrong. The lamplight should have thrown them straight back, sharp and black against the wall. But they weren't doing that. They were bending, stretching, like dark syrup being pulled from its jar. All of them. The shadow of the inkwell, the shadow of the book stack. They all leaned inward, curving toward the floating key to the circle of distorted darkness on the wall. I felt a chill, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. IT was a silence. IT was too complete. I realized I couldn't hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I couldn't hear the wind outside the window. The world had been muted, leaving only the sight of that turning key and the crawling shadows. I tried to speak Tio say something, but my throat was too dear. Wide MY lips wouldn't form the words. The key continued its slow, lazy rotation. IT was just a thing, to a simple, everyday thing, but it felt aware. IT felt like it was waiting. The shadows deepened. They grew thicker, darker. They weren't just leaning anymore. They were flowing a slow, viscous river of blackness, creeping across the wallpaper, all of it directed at that single point in the air, the center of everything. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs at a sound only I could hear in all that quiet. I wanted to get up. Tio, are you in? Tio swiped my hand to the air and knocked the key away. But a deeper instinct told me to be still, so not attract his attention. Whatever it was. Then the key stopped rotating. IT hung there, perfectly motionless, pointing at me. The teeth of the key were aimed right at my chest, a silent accusation. The cold in the room intensified. I could see my own breath, a faint puff of white in the lamplight. The shadows on the wall seemed to pulse at a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heart. I closed my eyes, just for a second, hoping it would be gone when I opened them, that this was just a trick of a tired mind. The darkness behind my eyelids felt safer. But when I looked again, it was still there, the key, the bent light, the waiting, and then it fell. Not with clatter, but with a soft, final tap on the wooden table to a simple, mundane sound. The shadows snapped back into place, normal and sharp. The hum of the house returned. The distant car passed on the street outside. The world rushed back in, filling the void left by the silence. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the key, lying there on the oak, innocent, lifeless. The cold slowly faded from my fingers, but it stayed a small, frozen stone in the pit of my stomach. I knew it was over, for now. But I also knew it was just a pause that a breath held, waiting to be let out again. The air in the old house was always thick, stale. It smelled of dust and forgotten things. I first noticed it on a Tuesday, a soft murmur, like a radio left on in another room, but the house was silent. I lived alone. I was reading in my armchair, the lamp casting a weak, yellow light. The words on the page began to blur, and I heard it, a low, breathy hum. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls themselves. I sat up straight. My skin felt cold. The hum wasn't a single sound. It was many, a jumble of quiet voices, all talking at once. I couldn't make out any words. It was just a whisper, a rustle of nonsense. I held my breath, listening. The old floral wallpaper seemed to pulse. Faint shadows, cast by the flickering lamp, twitched in the corners of my vision. I told myself it was the wind, the house settling. But there was no wind that night. I walked to the nearest wall, the one beside the staircase. I pressed my ear against the faded roses and vines. The paper was cool and slightly rough. The whispering grew no louder, but it felt closer, more intimate. It was like listening to a crowd of people speaking softly behind a closed door. I pulled my head away. My heart was a dull, heavy drum in my chest. That's when I saw the shadows on the ceiling. They were wrong. The light from my lamp was still. Nothing in the room was moving, but the shadows, they were shifting, sliding slowly across the plaster, like oil on water. They didn't form shapes. They were just long, dark smudges, twisting and curling against one another. I stood frozen in the center of the room. The whispers continued their soft, relentless stream. I caught a fragment, a single, clear syllable that stood out from murmur. My name. It was gone as soon as I heard it, swallowed back into the static of voices. A deep dread settled in my stomach. This wasn't my imagination. The house was talking, and it knew I was here. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door firmly behind me. The room felt safer, quieter. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The only sound was the frantic beat of my own blood in my ears. Then a new sound, a soft, scraping noise, like a fingernail gently dragging along the other side of the wall next to my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't listen. Don't hear it. The scraping stopped. The whispering began again. This time it was right there on the other side of plaster. The voices were still indistinct, but they were clearer now, more focused. I could hear the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of questions I couldn't understand. The soft exhalation of sighs. I pulled the blanket over my head. The fabric did nothing to block it out. The sound was inside the walls, inside my head. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Eventually, a strange calm washed over me, a numb acceptance. I lowered the blanket. The room was dark. The whispering had softened back to its original, distant hum. I looked at the wall. A pale sliver of moonlight fell across it from a window, and in that faint light, I saw the shadows on my bedroom wall begin to twist. They coiled together. Slowly, deliberately. They were no longer random. They were forming something. A shape I almost recognized. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just watched the shadows dance. I listened to the walls breathe, and I waited for them to finally find the words. The first thing I noticed was a cold, not the gentle chill of an autumn evening, not a draft from an old window frame. This was different, a solid, dense patch of winter hanging in the far corner of my bedroom. I was reading in bed. The lamp on my nightstand cast a warm, yellow circle over my pages. But over there in that corner, the light seemed to die. The shadows were too deep. They didn't flicker or move. They were just still and dark, the darkness that drank the light. I set my book down. The room was silent. The only sound was the soft rustle of my blanket as I shifted. I held my breath. Listen, there was a hum, that a low, steady vibration. I could feel in my teeth that IT wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. IT was just in the air, filling the silence. My eyes were fixed on that corner. The shapes there didn't make sense. The line where the walls met was too sharp. The angle was wrong, like the corner was receding, stretching back into a space that shouldn't be there. The shadows began to shift, not from any movement in the room. They moved on their own, pulling away from the baseboards, coalescing into something tall and thin. A knot of ice formed in my chest, and wide fingers gripped the edge of the comforter. The air from across the room reached me. IT carried a smell, damp soil, old stone. The scent of the place closed off in the sun for a very, very long time. The shape in the corner solidified. IT was a silhouette of pure blackness, a man-shaped void with a light. Simply ceased to exist. IT had no face and no features, just a tall, slender outline that stood perfectly motionless, watching me. The hum grew louder. IT was inside my head now at a static pressure against my eardrums. The cold spot was spreading that I could see my own breath out a faint, pale cloud that hung in the air in front of me. The warm light from my lamp seemed to shrink, pulling back from the advancing chill. I tried to speak. T.O. asked what it wanted. Y voice was a dry rustle in my throat. N.O. sound came out. The figure tilted its head at a slow, deliberate inclination, a gesture of cold curiosity. Then it took a step forward. IT made no sound. Its foot, if it had one, did not meet the floor. IT simply floated forward, an inch above the carpet. The shadows around it bled across the room, swallowing the pattern on the rug, swallowing the leg of my wooden chair, turning everything into a featureless, dark gray. I pushed myself back against the headboard. The wood was cold against my spine that I was shivering, and MY breath came in short, visible puffs. The thing was halfway across the room now. The hum was all I could hear, a droning note that promised nothing. It stopped at the foot of my bed. The air around it was so cold it hurt to breathe. The pale light from my lamp barely reached it, illuminating nothing. IT just stood there, a cutout of nothingness. I could feel the tension on me, a weightless, immense pressure. It raised one long, slender arm at a limb that tapered to a point that IT didn't gesture at me. IT didn't reach it. IT simply pointed at a single, sharp finger aimed at the space just beside my head. I couldn't look away. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. Tears froze at the corners of my eyes. The silence was absolute. The hum was gone. The world had been muted. Then, in the space next to my ear, I heard a whisper. IT wasn't a voice. IT was the sound of wind through a crack. The sound of dust settling. IT formed a single, clear word inside my mind. Mine. The figure dissolved. IT didn't fade. IT didn't walk away. IT simply unraveled into the air, like smoke in a sudden breeze. The cold vanished. The shadows in the corner were just shadows again. The hum was gone. The only sound was a frantic thumping in my chest. The warm light from my lamp flooded the room once more. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty corner. The air was warm again. The smell of earth was gone. Everything was normal, but my room no longer felt like my own. That single word hung in the silence, lingering in the space beside me, that a permanent cold spot in my memory. The air in my grandmother's house was always thick. The IT smelled of dust, and old wood polished the permanent twilight, even at noon. I was packing the last of her things. The bedroom was a museum of quiet memories that MY hands moved slowly, folding linen. The cloth felt cool and smooth against my fingers. Then, from the dresser in the corner, that a single drawer slammed shut. The sound was a gunshot in the silence, a sharp, final crack of wood against wood. I jumped, and my heart hammered against my ribs. The house had been so still. There was no one else here at no open window to lend a draft, just me and the dust motes dancing in the pale light. I stared at the dresser. IT was dark oak, heavy and old. Nothing else moved. The other drawers remained closed. I took a slow step forward. The floorboard creaked under my weight, and that's when I saw the shadows. They were wrong. The afternoon sun came in low through the window. IT should have cast everything long into the east. But these shadows, they stretched toward the dresser, the dark stain creeping across the floorboards, the leg of the chair, its shadow bending like a finger, pointing. The curtain's fringe, its shadow a reaching hand. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't how light worked. The room felt colder. The air grew heavy, pressing down on my skin. I stood perfectly still, watching the dark shapes slowly pull themselves across the room, all of them drawn to that single slammed drawer, the silent, gathering crowd. Then, a new sound of soft, rhythmic tapping that IT came from inside the dresser, from the same drawer that had shut itself. Tapped at a pause, tap, tap, like a fingernail on wood. IT wasn't loud, but it was clear at a patient, steady rhythm in the quiet. I should have our UN. MY legs felt like stone, and Y feet were rooted to the floor. The tapping continued. Its patter was almost familiar to the slow, maddening code. I forced myself to move 0.1 step. Then another. The tapping kept its pace. Tap, pause, tap, tap. I was close enough to touch the dresser now, though it felt icy under my fingertips. The smell of old paper and forgotten things drifted from the seams. I wrapped my fingers around the cold, brass-handled MY hand was shaking. The tapping stopped. The sudden silence was somehow louder, a deep, waiting quiet. The shadows on the floor seemed to hold their breath. I took one last, shallow breath, and I pulled the drawer open. It was empty, completely empty, and old photographs. No yellowed handkerchiefs, not even a speck of dust, just bare, polished wood. I leaned closer, my confusion a cold knot in my stomach, and then I saw IT, the very back of the drawer, not a single dark hair, long and fine, that IT looked like my grandmother's. As I watched, it trembled. Then it slid, all on its own, deeper into the shadow at the back of the drawer, and was gone. I closed the drawer. Gently this time the MY hands were numb. The room felt ordinary again. The shadows had returned to their proper places. The cold was gone. But as I turned to leave, a single soft tap came from the wall behind me, right where the dresser stood. I didn't look back, that I just walked out and closed the door behind me. The rain had been falling for 3 days. A steady, gray curtain against the kitchen window. I was wiping the fog from the glass of the old hallway mirror, the one my grandmother left me. Its ornate frame was chipped, the silvering at the edges beginning to flake away like dead skin. My hand moved in slow, lazy circles, revealing the dark wood of the hallway behind me, the worn runner rug, the closed bedroom door. I finished wiping, and the glass showed only darkness, a deep liquid blackness, not the reflection of my hallway, not the reflection of my own confused face. Just nothing. I leaned closer. My breath should have fogged the surface. It did not. The darkness within the mirror seemed to swallow the light from the single bulb above. It was a pool of ink, a hole cut into the world. I reached out a finger, touched the cold, smooth glass. The darkness rippled, a slow, oily wave moving out from the point of contact. The shadows in the glass began to shift, coalescing. They moved like smoke underwater. There was no sound. only the distant patter of rain outside. A profound silence seemed to emanate from the mirror, a silence that pressed against my ears. Then a hum, so low I felt it in my teeth, a vibration deep in the bone. It was a single, sustained note. It held no warmth. It was the hum of a dead wire, the hum of empty space. I tried to pull my hand back. My fingers remained pressed against the cold glass. They were numb. The hum began to change. It twisted. The single note fractured, bent itself into something new. It was a melody, a simple, childlike sequence of notes. It was familiar, a music box tune my mother used to play. But it was wrong. The notes were slightly out of tune, slowed down, as if the mechanism was rusting shut. The sound wasn't in the room. It was inside my head, filling the spaces between my thoughts. The darkness in the mirror continued to swirl. The shadows began to take shape, forming a silhouette, a tall, thin outline. It had no features, no face, no details, just a man-shaped void at the far end of the reflected hallway, a place where my own reflection should have been. The melody played on, that slow, decaying lullaby. The figure in the mirror did not move. It simply stood, watching from the darkness. I could feel its gaze, a cold point on my skin. The air grew heavy, damp. It smelled of wet stone, of old, closed-up rooms. I finally wrenched my hand from the glass. The numbness lingered, a deep cold in my fingertips. The figure in the mirror remained. The melody softened, fading to a whisper at the edge of hearing. I took a step back, my socked feet silent on the wooden floor. The figure in the mirror took a step forward. No sound of footfall, just a smooth, silent advance. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. I took another step back, and another. My shoulder brushed against the wall. There was nowhere else to go. The figure in the mirror matched my retreat, gliding closer through the impossible darkness. It was at the forefront of the glass now, so close. I could see the subtle movement within its form, the swirling, restless shadows. The melody had stopped. The only sound was a frantic beat of my own blood in my ears. And then a new sound, a soft, scratching whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the air itself. It was a single word, my name. The figure in the mirror lifted a hand, a shadowy limb without fingers. It pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. The surface bowed slightly, like a film of water. I closed my eyes. I couldn't look anymore. I squeezed them shut, counted to 3. The rain had stopped. A strange quiet filled the house. I forced my eyes open. The mirror was just a mirror again. It showed my pale, terrified face, the familiar hallway behind me, the worn runner rug, the closed bedroom door. I let out a shaky breath. My body went limp with relief. I leaned against the wall, my knees weak, and then I saw it, in the reflection, over my own shoulder, the bedroom door. It was now slightly ajar, a sliver of perfect darkness showing from within, and from that darkness, the faint, decaying melody began to play once more. The air in my grandmother's house was always thick. It smelled of dust, and old wood polished the heavy, settled smell. I was packing the last of the china. The late afternoon sun was weak. It cast long, tired shadows across the living room floor. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. That's when I saw it. The rocking chair by the fireplace, that IT moved. Not a rock, not a slide. A slow, deliberate shift of its legs to the left. Just an inch. Though it groaned softly against the floorboards, I stopped in my hand, still holding a dinner plate. I stared. Maybe the floor was uneven. Maybe I'd bumped it. The chair slid again. This time it was a full, smooth glide as if on IT stopped a foot from where it started. Perfectly centered on the hearth, our UGRMY breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. This was impossible. I took a step closer. The house was silent. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, MY own heartbeat in my ears. Then the shadows on the wall behind the chair bent. They didn't move with the fading light. They curled, like dark smoke twisting up from a snuff candle. The shape of the chair's shadow stretched, its arms becoming long, thin tendrils that licked the floral wallpaper. I took a step back. MY's skin felt cold. The chair slid once more. It was facing me now. Its empty seat, a dark promise. The woven came back seemed to stare. The room felt smaller. The walls closer. The only sound was a faint, dry rustle, like old leaves skittering across pavement. I thought about calling out. But who would I call? The house was empty. IT had been empty for years. Really, I was just a ghost here myself, tidying up a life already lived. The chair began to move toward me. Not quickly. Not with any violence. IT was a patient, creeping slide. Its wooden legs whispered as they dragged over the rug at a soft, shuffling sound. IT moved in a slow, straight line, leaving the fireplace behind, coming into the open space of the room, coming toward me. I couldn't move. MY feet were rooted to the spot. MY fingers were cold around the china plate. The air grew heavier, colder. IT smelled different now. Less like dust, more like damp earth, like the cellar under the house. The chair stopped. Just a few feet away, IT was so close I could see the fine cracks in its varnish, the worn spot on the arm where my grandmother would rest her hand. IT was just a chair, a simple, old rocking chair, and yet it felt like the most menacing thing I had ever seen. Its shadow on the floor was wrong. The IT was too dark, too solid. IT didn't mimic the chair's shape anymore. IT was a pool of deep blackness that a hole cut out of the world. Then the cushion indented. It happened slowly. The floral fabric compressed today as if an invisible weight had just settled into the seat. A deep, slow creak came from the wood. The sound of someone leaning back, getting comfortable. I stopped breathing. The chair began to rock, ever so slightly, at a gentle, rhythmic motion, back and forth, back and forth. The rustling sound returned, but now it was closer. IT was right in front of me. I finally found my legs. I took a stumbling step back. Then another. The plate slipped from my hand. IT hit the floor with a sharp crack. The sound was violently loud in the hushed room. The rocking stopped. The indentation in the cushion faded. The fabric smoothed itself out. The chair was just a chair again, sitting silently in the middle of the rug. The shadows on the wall were normal now, long and still. The smell of dust returned. I stood there for a long time, just watching it, waiting for it to move again. But it never did. I left the broken plate on the floor. I walked out of the room. I didn't look back, but sometimes in my own quiet apartment, I'll hear a soft, dry rustle, and I'll feel a cold spot in the air, and I'll note I wasn't the only thing that left that house. The air in my apartment was always still this late, thick and warm. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, pale shapes across the floor. I was drifting on the couch, not quite asleep, not quite awake. Then a click to the sudden electric breath from the old television in the corner. The screen bloomed to life with a silent wash of static. The dry, gray light filled the room. I hadn't touched the remote. IT was sitting on the coffee table, dark and silent, and I just watched. The static shifted. IT churned like a slow, formless cloud. Then, for a single heartbeat, an image surfaced, a blur of green, a familiar shape. The old oak tree from my childhood backyard. IT was there, and then it was gone, swallowed back into gray. My breath caught in my chest. A low hum began to emanate from the SET. IT was a physical feeling, a vibration in my teeth. The flickering light from the screen started to pulse dot on and off, dot on and off, and a hum. It pulsed right along with it, a slow, rhythmic thrum that filled the silence. Shadows began to move, not like normal shadows, stretching and bending with the light. These rippled. They slid up the walls like oil on water. They gathered in the corner of the ceiling, a dark stain that seemed to breathe. The pulse of the light, the pulse of the HUM.IT was all connected, a single, sickening heartbeat for the room. I tried to sit up, but MY muscles felt heavy, weighted down. The flickering was so fast, now the frantic, silent strobe. I in the burst of light. The room was wrong. The chair was in a different place. That a book was now on the floor. The MY reflection in the dark window was gone, replaced by a deeper, formless dark. Another image flashed on the screen, not a face MY face, but younger, eyes wide with fear I had long forgotten. The day I fell from that oak tree, the sharp crack of a branch, the way the sky spun above me. The memory was a cold stone in my stomach. The screen showed it all in a 2-second burst of grainy film. The hum grew louder. IT wasn't just in my ears anymore. IT was in my bones, the deep, resonant frequency that made my vision blur. The shadows on the walls were no longer just shapes. They had texture, the suggestion of something solid, something waiting just beyond the pale light. The air grew cold. I could see my own breath now, a faint mist that hung in the frantic strobe. I had to move. I had to make it stop. With a force of will that felt like tearing metal, I pushed myself off the couch. The floor was icy against my bare feet that I took a step. The television flickered and the room shifted. The coffee table was suddenly closer and I stumbled. Another step. The hum was a pressure in my skull, a silent scream building behind my eyes that I could see the power cord now, snaking down behind the wooden stand, MY Gold.MY only thought. The screen went completely black. For a single blessed moment, there was only the faint streetlight and silence. The hum was gone. The flickering had stopped. I stood there, frozen, my hand outstretched. Had it ended? Then a final soft flicker. The screen lit up one last time. That IT wasn't static. IT wasn't a memory. IT was a live feed, a view from the television itself. That I saw the back of my own head, my body tense, reaching for plug. And over my shoulder, in the rippling shadows on the wall behind me, a tall, slender shape was standing, watching. The screen went dark. The room was still. The street lamp cast its long, pale shapes. Everything was exactly as it was before. Except for the silence, IT was no longer emptied. IT was now a listening silence. And the air had stayed cold. It began in early winter, when the air turned still enough to hear your own breath linger. I had just moved into the old house at the end of the lane, the one with the peeling blue door, and the strange way light refused to settle in the corners. Most days were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to skip the trees outside my window. It started with something small, a spoon. I placed it beside my cup of tea, looked away for a moment, and when I looked back, it was gone, not misplaced, gone. I stood there for a while, watching the steam rise from the cup. My hand trembled, waiting for the familiar clink of metal against porcelain. It came from the counter behind me. The spoon lay there, perfectly still, dry. I remember the way my throat felt tight, like the air had grown heavier. I tried to laugh, but even that sounded hollow. Days passed. Then a book disappeared from the table. Then a key. Then my phone. Every time, the same pattern. A flicker in my vision. A breath caught in my chest. And when I turned, it would be somewhere else. Never far. Just wrong. At first, I thought I was tired. The house was old. Maybe it shifted. Maybe I did too. But one night, I saw it happen. The lamp beside my bed, it trembled, just slightly, like something beneath the surface was pushing through. The light dimmed, and for a moment, the lamp stretched. Its shape pulled thin, like a reflection on water. Then it was gone. The pale ring of its glow slid across the wall, like it was still searching for a body. When the lamp returned, its cord was tangled around the leg of the chair, knotted tight. The shadows didn't sit right after that. They leaned away from the walls, moved when I didn't. Sometimes I could feel them watching, the quiet hum of their patience, like static under my skin. I started leaving the lights on, but even light felt unreliable here. One night, I dropped my pen while writing. It rolled under the desk. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the cold floorboards, and touched nothing, only air and a faint warmth, as if something had just been there. When I sat back up, the pen rested on the windowsill, its tip pressed against the glass, as though it had written something there in the fog. A line, when I couldn't read. I tried not to think about it, but I began to notice the gaps, tiny pauses in the world, the second between a blink and an inhale, the tremor before silence. And in those moments, objects waited to move. The picture on the wall shifted left. The rug folded slightly, as if someone had stepped across it. My own reflection started to lag. When I turned my head, it stayed still for a heartbeat too long. I learned not to touch anything, not to blink too often. It didn't help. Yesterday, I woke to find my chair missing, only dust where it had been. When I opened the closet, it was inside, facing the wall. Tonight, I'm sitting on the floor, writing this slowly, watching the pen in my hand. The air around me feels thinner, like it's holding its breath. The walls hum, a low vibration, like something alive beneath the plaster. I can feel them now, the spaces between things. Listening, waiting. The lamp flickers again. A shadow bends wrong across the ceiling. And I realize it's not the objects that are vanishing. It's the world, sliding away, piece by piece, until only I remain. And then I won't. The rain had been falling for 3 days. A steady, gray drizzle that blurred the windows and left the world smelling of wet earth and decay. I was alone in the old house, the one my grandfather had left me. The silence was a heavy blanket, broken only by the constant drumming on the roof. I sat in the armchair, a book rested in my lap. But I wasn't reading. I was just listening to the rain, to the quiet creaks of the house settling, to the nothing, and then a new sound. It was so faint at first. I thought it was the wind, finding a new gap in the eaves. A soft, rustling whisper. I held my breath. The book in my lap felt suddenly heavy. The whisper came again. It wasn't from the walls or the windows. It was coming from down the hall, from the bedroom, from the closet. I stood up. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. Each step toward the hallway felt like a mile. The air grew colder. The pale light from the living room lamp didn't reach far. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows. The whispering continued, a low, hush murmur. No words I could understand. Just a stream of soft, secret sounds. It was the sound of leaves skittering across pavement. The sound of a page turning in an empty room. I reached the bedroom doorway. The closet door was shut. A simple, white-paneled door. I'd opened it a dozen times since I'd moved in. It was just a closet, empty, except for a few wire hangers. But now, a thin line of darkness ran along its edge. The whispers seemed to coil out from that crack. They wrapped around the silence, squeezing it. I took a step into the room. The air was still. Dust motes hung frozen in the dim light. My heart was a dull hammer against my ribs. I could feel the whisper against my skin, a dry, papery touch. Another step. The floorboard groaned under my weight. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. I stared at the white door. My hand was trembling. I reached out. My fingers were inches from the cool brass knob. And then I saw it, the shadow at the bottom of the door. It was wrong. It was too deep, too black, and it was moving. It wasn't just a shadow cast by something else. It was pooling, like spilled ink. It seeped out from under the door, thick and liquid. It crept across the worn wooden floor. Slow, deliberate. It didn't fade in the dim light. It swallowed the light. The darkness stretched towards me, a long, thin tendril reaching for my foot. I stumbled back. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow paused. It seemed to consider me. Then it began to pull back, sliding silently across the floor, retreating under the door, leaving no trace. The closet was just a door again, quiet, innocent. I stood there for a long time. My whole body was cold. The house was silent, save for the rain. I backed out of the room. I didn't turn my back on the door. I walked backwards down the hall, into the living room. I sat in the armchair, pulling my knees up to my chest. I just stared down the dark hallway, waiting, listening. The rain kept falling. And a few minutes later, so did the whispers, softer this time, almost patient. I'm still in the chair. The lamp is on. The book is on the floor. The hallway is a mouth of shadows. And the whispers are still talking, just for me. The floorboards in the old house on Hemlock Lane were always dusty, a thick gray blanket of neglect. But that night, under the weak light of a single bulb, they began to glimmer, a soft silver sheen, like the trail a snail leaves behind. I was taking out the trash. A normal Tuesday. The kitchen linoleum was cold under my bare feet. Then I stepped onto the wood of the hallway, and I felt a warmth, a gentle, unnatural heat. I stopped, looked down. The dust itself seemed to be shining, holding onto the last bit of daylight from the window. But it was past midnight. There was no light to hold. I knelt. The air was still. It tasted like old wood and forgotten birthdays. I ran my fingers over a board. It was smooth, not from wear, but from something else. Something that made my skin prickle. The glimmer shifted. It pulsed faintly, a slow, breathing light, and with it came a hum, so low I felt in my teeth. A deep, vibrating drone from the very bones of the house. It wasn't a sound you hear. It was a sound you become. I stood up, my breath hitched in my throat. The shadows between the floorboards began to move, not like shadows from a flickering lamp. These were thick, liquid. They coiled up from the seams. Like black smoke, they twisted in the air, slow and deliberate. They had weight. I could feel their presence against my skin. A cold pressure. The hum grew louder, deeper. It was the only thing in the world. The glimmer on the floor brightened. The shadows danced with it. A silent, terrible ballet. One of the shadows stretched. It slid across the floor towards my foot. I should have moved. I should have run. But I was rooted, fascinated. The dark tendril touched my bare toe. It was not cold. It was nothing. A complete absence of feeling. A void. It started to climb. A slow, creeping numbness up my ankle. The hum was inside my head now, filling the spaces between my thoughts. The glimmer from the floorboards began to show things. Flecks of color in the silver. A flash of my mother's favorite yellow dress. The sound of her laughter woven into the drone. The scent of her perfume, lilac and dust. Then it was gone. Another shadow moved. This one wrapped around my calf. The numbness spread. A heavy, peaceful nothingness. The hum promised it was easier to just be still, to just listen. Another image in the glimmer. My old dog, Buster, running across a summer lawn. The feel of his fur under my hand. The warmth of the sun on my face. The memories were being pulled from me, played back on the shimmering wooden screen. Each one a little brighter. Each one a little more final. The shadows climbed higher. They were part of the floor, and the floor was part of the house. And the house was now part of me. The hum softened. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to stay, to be part of the quiet, shining history of this place. The last thing I saw in the glimmer was my own face, reflected back from a polished board, but younger, happier, a version of me I hadn't seen in years. It smiled, and then it faded. The shadows receded, sliding back into the cracks. The numbness left my legs. The hum faded to a distant, almost imaginary thrum. The floorboards were just floorboards again, dusty and dark. I stood there for a long time. The cold linoleum of the kitchen was a shock against my feet. I finished taking out the trash. I came back inside. I avoid the hallway now. I walk a different path. But sometimes, late at night, I'll sit at the edge of the carpet, and I'll just look at the glimmering floor, and listen for the hum. It's still there, waiting. The boxes in the attic were all marked. Neat black letters on faded cardboard. Christmas, winter clothes, baby things, a map of a life I'd almost forgotten. The air was thick that IT smelled of warm dust, and old pine, a single, bare bulb hung from the rafters. Its light was weak that yellowed. IT left deep pockets of shadow in the corners of the room. I was looking for my old high school yearbook, the foolish, sentimental urge, and my knees ached against the rough floorboards. The only sound was my own breath and the soft rustle of my sleeve against the box. Then a hum. It was so low, at first a vibration in my teeth more than a noise, that I stopped, listened. The house was silent below me, but the hum was there, to a steady, electric thrum coming from nowhere, from everywhere. I turned back to boxes, tried to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. That's when I saw the shift. Out of the corner of my eye, the shadows in the far corner. They were wrong. They weren't just dark. They were thick that a pool of ink spilled on the floor, and they were moving, stretching. The shadow from an old dresser leaned away from it, bending, pulled toward the corner like iron to a magnet. My breath caught. The hum grew louder to the pressure in my ears. And in the center of that darkness, it stood, a figure, tall and impossibly still. Its shape was a man's, but blurred at the edges as if it were made of smoke and static. IT had no face, just a smooth, dark plane where features should have been. I couldn't move. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. The air grew cold, and a winter chill that seeped right through my sweater. The thing didn't move. IT just watched. I felt its gaze, a physical weight on my skin. The hum was inside my head now, filling the silence it had brought with it. The shadows continued to bend. The leg of a chair's shadow stretched thin, snaking across the floorboards to touch the edge of the figure's foot. The darkness around it deepened, swallowing the weak light from the bulb. I tried to speak. T.O. form a word, a question, a plea, but my throat was sealed shut and my lips were numb. The figure remained a silent sentinel in the corner of my attic. I in the corner of my life. I didn't need to move. Its presence was enough the truth I couldn't look away from. This was not an intruder. This was something that had always been here, waiting, and now the door was open. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me, frozen on my knees, IT, a statue of living shadow. The only change was a light. The bulb seemed to grow weaker, dimmer, at an S if the darkness were drinking it. Then, without a sound, it was gone. Not a fade. Not a retreat point one moment. It was there, the solid fact in the world. The next, the corner was just a corner again. The hum stopped. The sudden silence was louder than the noise had been. The shadows were just shadows, lifeless and still. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. IT shook. The air was warm again. Dust motes danced in the returning light. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. I closed the box in front of me. I didn't need the yearbook anymore. I stood up slowly. MY joints protested. I didn't look back at the corner. I didn't need to. I knew it was still watching from a place without light. And I knew the hum would return. IT was just a matter of time. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not a true silence, of course. The city was always humming, a distant mechanical breath. But inside my apartment, the air had gone still. IT was a thick, heavy quiet, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I set my book down on the coffee table. The soft thud was too loud in the hush. That's when I heard the other thing go low. Steady HUM. IT wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. IT was in the air itself, a vibration that seemed to originate inside my own head. I stood up, my knees cracking, walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. The hum followed me. IT was a constant, pulsing pressure, like the room was holding its breath, and waiting. From the corner of my eye, a shadow moved. Just a flicker, I turned my head. The shadow my lamp cast on the far wall. It was wrong that IT was too long, stretching up toward the ceiling, thin and distorted as if the light source had moved. But the lamp was perfectly still. I took a slow breath, told myself it was a late hour and why tired mind playing tricks. The glass of water was cool in my hand. I took a sip. The water did nothing to ease the dry tightness in my throat. Then a whisper. It was barely there, the rustle of air, like pages turning and old words. Just a sense of a voice. IT came from the hallway leading to the bedroom. I stood frozen, the glass halfway to my lips, listening. The hum in the air grew a little louder, the dull, persistent throb. The shadow on the wall twitched. I didn't want to look at it. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark mouth of the hallway. Another whisper. This one was closer, just behind my right shoulder. I spun around. Nothing there, just the empty living room, the soft glow of the lamp. But the air felt cold there to a small pocket of winter in my warm apartment. My heart was a dull drum in my chest. I could feel it in my fingertips. I walked toward the hallway, my steps slow and quiet. The wooden floor was cool beneath my socks. The darkness in the hallway seemed to swell. T.O. drank the light from a room. A third whisper. This one was different. IT had a shape that a single hissed syllable I couldn't quite make out. That IT came from the darkness ahead of me. And at the same time, from right beside my ear, I stopped at the edge of the light, peered into the blackness of the hall. The hum was a physical thing now, the pressure against my skin. I could feel in my teeth. And then the shadows began to move, not just the one on the wall. All of them. The dark space under the table, it shifted like liquid. The corner by the front door, it deepened, stretching toward me. They were alive, crawling, stretching, reaching. They had no form, no features, just a deep, hungry blackness that defied the light. I took a step back, that MY breath caught in my lungs. The whisper came again. Clearer this time. Alone. It was a dry, rustling voice, like wind through dead leaves. IT didn't seem to come from one place. That IT came from everywhere. from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside my own mind. You are alone. The shadow from the lamp stretched all the way across the ceiling now, the dark vein pulsing in time with the hum. The one under the table pulled on the floor, spreading toward my feet. I backed away until the cold wall stopped me. Nowhere else to go. I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe it was a dream, a bad, waking dream. But I could still feel the hum. I could still hear the rustling, whispering voices, a chorus of them now, overlapping. Alone, alone, alone did I open my eyes. The shadows had retreated. They were back in their proper places. Just ordinary darkness. The oppressive hum had faded to a faint, almost imperceptible buzz. The air felt light again as I slid down the wall onto the floor, and my whole body was trembling. I drew my knees up to my chest, wrapped my arms around them. The apartment was silent, the way it's supposed to be, but I know it wasn't over. IT was just a pause, a quiet moment for me to catch my breath, because the whispers, they weren't gone, they're never gone, they're just growing, waiting for the lights to go out again. The first few nights in the new apartment were a gift, a deep, city quiet I hadn't known was possible. No sirens, no shouting from the street, just the occasional hum of the refrigerator, a peaceful silence. I'd lie in the dark and just breathe it in. Then the soft footsteps started. It was a Thursday or a Tuesday. The days bled together here. I was reading in bed, the lamp casting a warm yellow circle on the wall, and I heard it, a gentle pressure on the floorboards in the hallway, a slow, patient shift of weight. I held my breath, the book heavy in my hands. The sound came again, not a creak, not the old building settling. This was different, deliberate, a soft footfall, then another, pacing just outside my door. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I called out, "Hello." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow louder, thicker. It pressed against my ears. I waited for a voice, for a knock. Nothing. After 10 frozen minutes, I crept to the door. The hallway was empty. Just a pale light from the street lamp filtering through the window at the far end. The air was cold. Still, I ran my hand over the wooden floor where the steps had been. It felt ordinary, smooth and slightly dusty. I told myself it was a neighbor, or the pipes, a sound traveling in a strange way through the walls. But the next night, they returned. I was at the kitchen sink, washing a single glass. The water was warm on my hands. The scent of soap filled the air. And then, from the living room, the soft footsteps, a slow, circling pattern around the rug. I turned the water off. My wet hands dripped onto the linoleum. The footsteps paused, as if listening, waiting for my next move. I took a step toward the living room archway. The floorboard under my foot groaned, a sharp, ugly sound. From the dark living room, a soft footstep answered. A single, clear press into the carpet. A shadow in the corner of the room seemed to deepen, to pull in on itself. It was reacting to me. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a recording. This wasn't the house settling. This was a presence, a thing sharing the space with me. A cold dread, heavy and slick, settled in my stomach. I backed away, slowly, one careful step at a time. I didn't turn my back. I retreated all the way to my bedroom and closed the door. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The house was silent again, but it was a watchful silence, a waiting silence. Last night, I decided to test it. I sat in the middle of the living room floor. The only light was a moon through the blinds, painting the room in stripes of weak, silver light. The air was so still, I could smell the faint odor of old books and dust. I tapped my finger on the floor. Once, twice, from the hallway, a single soft footstep echoed my rhythm. A chill crawled up my spine. I held up my hand, my fingers casting long shadows on the wall. I waved. In the dark archway, a shadow detached itself from the others. It was formless, just a deeper patch of darkness. It shifted. It swayed, ever so slightly, mirroring the movement of my hand. My blood went cold. This was no echo. It was a conversation. I stood up, my legs feeling weak. The shadow in the archway didn't move. I took a step toward the kitchen. from the hallway. A soft footstep moved in the same direction. I stopped. It stopped. We stood there for what felt like an hour. Me, in the striped moonlight. It, in the dark of the hall. Just existing together. The air grew thick, heavy with strange understanding. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was just here, and it wanted me to know that. Now the rules have changed. The quiet is different. It's a shared quiet. I move through my rooms, and I can feel it listening. I can feel its attention like a subtle pressure against my skin. Sometimes I whisper something to the empty air, just a word, hello, or I'm here. And a moment later, from another room, a single, soft footstep will press into the floor. A gentle, quiet answer in the dark, a confirmation. I am not alone anymore, and I don't know if that's a comfort. Or the most terrifying thing of all, the air in the house was perfectly still. A thick, warm stillness that settles in late summer, when the only thing you can hear is the low hum of the refrigerator. I was reading on the sofa, the fabric rough against my arm. The light from a window was soft and golden, painting the hallway floor. Everything was quiet. Everything was calm. Then the door slammed. It wasn't a click. It was a violent, shuddering bang that shook the wall. A shockwave of force that punched the air from my lungs. The book fell from my hands, its pages whispering as they hit the floor. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I stared down the empty hallway, at the closed door to the bedroom. No one else was home. The house had been empty for hours. I held my breath, listening. There was only the dull throb in my ears. The faint smell of dust kicked up by the impact. I pushed myself up from the sofa. My legs felt unsteady. The wooden floor was cool under my bare feet. I walked slowly toward the hallway. Each step felt too loud in the new silence. The shadows in the hall seemed deeper than they should be. The pale light from the living room didn't reach far. It felt like walking into a pool of dark water. I was halfway down the hall when I saw it. The shadow on the wall began to twist. It was my own shadow, cast by the light behind me. But it was wrong. It stretched, its head elongating, thinning out like pulled taffy. The arms seemed to reach for the ceiling. I stopped. My own body was standing perfectly still. But my shadow on the wall was moving. It tilted its head. A slow, unnatural bend. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't possible. I took a hesitant step backward. My shadow on the wall did not follow. It remained, stretched and distorted. Then it melted, flowing up the wall like spilled ink, spreading across the ceiling above me. The air grew cold. Goosebumps rose on my arms. I could feel a faint pressure, a weight from above. I didn't want to look up, but I had to. The ceiling was a canvas of shifting darkness. The shadow pulled there, formless. Then it began to drip. Thick, black tendrils dripped down from the ceiling. They didn't fall. They oozed, reaching for the floor. For me, I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the wall. The touch was icy. The shadow on the ceiling pulsed. It had no face, no features. But I felt it watching me. A deep, silent attention. The golden light from the living room flickered, not like a bulb dying. It dimmed, as if something was passing in front of it. Something I couldn't see. A soft rustling sound filled the air, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It came from all around me, from the walls, from the ceiling. The dripping tendrils of shadow retracted, pulling back into the main pool above. The darkness on the ceiling swirled. Then it all flowed, swift and silent, back down the wall. It settled into the shape of a man, a tall, thin silhouette standing at the end of the hall, where my bedroom door was. It stood perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. It was just a shadow again, a flat, dark shape. But it was in the wrong place. The light was behind me. Any shadow I cast should be in front of me. This one faced me. We stood there in the quiet hall. The house was silent once more. The only sound was my own shaky breath. The shadow did not breathe. It just waited. Then, without a sound, it faded. It didn't move away. It simply dissolved, like smoke in a still room, leaving behind only the empty hallway and the closed bedroom door. I stood there for a long time, The coolness of the walls seeped into my skin. The normal sounds of the house did not return. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. The world outside the windows was silent. I finally took a step forward. Then another. My hand reached out for the doorknob. The metal was cold. I turned it. The latch clicked. I pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, and from within that darkness, I heard a soft, slow breath. It was not my own. The air in my grandmother's house was always still, thick with the smell of old books and dust. I was packing the last of her things. The late afternoon sun was weak, and IT cast long, tired shadows across the living room. I was taping a cardboard box shut when I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, the lamp on the side table. IT was a simple thing that a ceramic base, a faded yellow shade. IT drifted upward as if pulled by a single, invisible string. It wasn't a jerk or a sudden lurch. IT was a smooth, gentle ascent, floating up from the wooden surface, leaving a perfect circle of dust behind. I held my breath that MY hands went still on the cardboard flaps. This wasn't happening. IT couldn't be. But it was. The lamp hovered. Then it began to move, gliding slowly through the still air of the room as if swimming through honey. It moved toward the center of the room, and that's when I saw the shadows. They were wrong. The shadow the lamp cast on the far wall. IT didn't just follow the shape, it moved on its own, stretching and contracting, like a black lung, breathing. Other shadows in the room seemed to lean toward it. The shadow of a chair leg twitched. The shadow of a curtain swayed without any breeze. They were all drawn to the floating lamp at a slow, silent congregation of darkness. A low hum filled the room. IT was a sound I hadn't noticed before, the quiet vibration of an old house. But it changed as I watched the lamp drift. The hum softened, IT smoothed out. Finding a single clear note, IT was almost musical to a deep, resonant tone that I felt in my teeth. The lamp began to turn to slow, lazy rotation, and as it turned, the hum shifted with it, rising and falling in a faint, discordant melody to a tune I almost recognized, something from forgotten dream. The floating lamp was beautiful, in a way that made my skin feel cold, a terrible, impossible beauty. The pale light threw its yellow shade through shifting patterns on the ceiling, gold and gray, dancing together. I should have been terrified, and I was at a deep, cold dread was pooling in my stomach. But underneath it was wonder, the pure, childlike awe at the impossible thing happening right in front of me. The lamp completed its slow journey across the room that IT came to a stop, hovering perfectly still, right above my grandmother's old armchair. The place where she always sat at the fabric was worn thin in the shape of her. The melodic hum held its note out, a single, sustained tone that vibrated in the air. The shadows on the wall grew still. They stopped their breathing, their twitching. They were just waiting, watching me, as I was watching them. Then the lamp tilted, just slightly. The shade angled down out as if looking at the empty chair. And for a single heart-stopping moment, I saw her. Not a ghost, not a figure, but a suggestion the way the light fell, a familiar curve of a shoulder in the shadow, the memory of a presence, summoned by the light in the silence. The hum faded, not into silence, but back into the ordinary, quiet hum of the house. The lamp began its slow descent, and he settled onto the small table beside the armchair, as if it had never moved. The room was just a room again. The shadows were just shadows. The only light was a pale, dying sun to the window. I stood there for a long time, MY hand still pressed against the cardboard box. The air still smelled of dust and old books, but everything felt different. The ordinary world had cracked open, just for a moment, and I had seen the quiet, impossible thing living inside. I looked at the lamp. IT was just a lamp, but I knew I would never be able to turn it on again. The air in my bedroom was still, thick and warm. The only light was a pale stripe from the street lamp cutting across the floorboards. I was floating in that space between waking and sleep when the first tap came. It wasn't loud, just a single, clear note from the corner of the room. Near the old closet, a tap on glass. I held my breath, my blanket pulled up to my chin. Then another, from the wall beside my bed. This one was softer, a gentle knock of something hard and deep. Our wide MY eyes strained, searching the darkness. There was nothing there, Just a shifting of shadows from a passing car. A third tap. This one from the window itself. Right on the other side of the pane. I didn't move that I couldn't. The silence between each tap was a heavy weight on my chest that IT felt deliberate, like a countdown. I started to notice the shadows, and they didn't move with the light anymore. They stayed, coiled in the corner like thick black rope. They had a texture, a fuzzy, breathing depth that I could feel them more than see them at a cold spot in the room, draining the warmth. Another tap. This one was different. IT came from the foot of my bed at a slow, scraping tap, followed by a faint rustle. Like old paper being unfolded, and my heart was a frantic bird in a cage of bone that I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe it was a dream, just a bad dream. But when I opened them, the shadows were closer. They had crept over the floorboards, a dark stain spreading towards me. The air grew colder. IT smelled of dust and forgotten spaces of damp earth. And then I saw it, a figure. Standing in the deepest part of the gloom, near the door, IT was tall and thin, that a silhouette cut from the absence of light. IT had no face, just a smooth, blank space where features should have been that. IT didn't move. IT just waited. Tap. The sound was right next to my ear on the nightstand. I flinched, a small gasp escaping my lips. The figure remained still, but the shadows around it pulsed like a slow, sleeping heart. I wanted to scream, Tio, call out for someone, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the thick quiet. All I could do was watch and listen. The taps began to change. They weren't random knocks anymore. They formed a pattern to a slow, dragging rhythm. Point one, then two, a pause, then a third, softer one. IT was a code I couldn't understand, a language of something that had no voice. The faceless figure shifted, not its body, but the space around IT. IT seemed to lean forward without moving. The pressure in the room changed, and my ears popped. The pale light from the window flickered, as if dimmed by a passing cloud. But the sky was clear. The shadows were the edge of my rug now, and I could feel their cold breath on my ankles, a dry, static touch. The figure felt close in the door. Its presence filled the room, the hollow pressure. The tapping stopped. The sudden silence was worse. IT was a listening silence. That IT was waiting for me, that I held my breath until my lungs burned. Then a final TAP. I didn't come from the walls or the window. IT came from inside my own head, a sharp, clear click, like a stone dropped into a deep, dark well. In that moment, I understood. The taps were never a warning. They were a countdown, and it had just reached zero. The shadows uncoiled. The figure took a single, soft step forward, and the pale light finally went out. The morning light was thin, that paled. IT fell through my kitchen window in dusty, tired streaks. I watched the particles of dust dance in those weak beams. They moved without any real purpose, just floating, endlessly shifting. The air in my apartment was perfectly still. Yet I could feel a hum. Not a sound you hear with your ears, but one you feel in your teeth at a low, constant vibration, like the building itself was holding its breath. I poured a cup of coffee. The ceramic mug was warm in my hand, a small, solid comfort. The liquid was dark and bitter. I stared into its surface. My own distorted reflection stared back from the blackness. The hum was patient. IT had been here for weeks now. Maybe months. It never got louder. IT never got softer. IT was just a part of things, a new layer to the silence. I walked from the kitchen into the living room. The floorboards were cool under my bare feet. A shadow in the corner of the room seemed thicker than it should have been, not denser. IT didn't move. IT didn't have a shape. IT was just a patch of deeper dark in a room full of light that I looked at it for a long time. And I had the strangest feeling it was looking back. This is my home. These are my things. The sofa, the bookshelf, the television. But they don't feel like mine anymore. They feel like props, placed here for my benefit or for its. I sat on the sofa. The fabric was rough against my skin, that I could feel the hum coming up through the cushions at a gentle, relentless tremor. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I tried to remember what the silence used to feel like, the true silence, an empty one that I couldn't. There was a rustle. Not from outside. Not from the walls. IT was closer. IT was the sound of the pages of a book on my coffee table turning point one by one, that I opened my eyes. The book was perfectly still. Its cover was closed, but the feeling of movement lingered in the air. This is the way it is now. Small things, impossible things. They don't frighten me anymore. They just are. The apartment feels alive, a sleeping creature, and I am just a guest inside its body. I got up and went to the window. The world outside was moving. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. Life was happening, but it was all behind a pane of glass, muffled and distant, like I was watching a movie of a world I no longer belonged to. My own breath fogged the glass for a second, then faded. The hum remained. Sometimes at night, I feel a pressure on the edge of the bed as if someone has sat down that I never open my eyes, I just lie there, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, and the faint, patient hum that exists just beneath it. We share the space, we share the silence. I turned from a window. The shadow in the corner was still there. IT seemed a little larger now, or maybe I was just more aware of IT. IT was a presence, a lingering that a thing that had decided to stay. And the most disturbing part, the part one can barely admit to myself, is that I'm not sure I wanted to leave. The loneliness without it would be so much louder. I picked up my coffee MUG'd. IT was cold now. The warmth had bled away into the still air of the apartment. I took it back to the kitchen. The hum followed me to a soft, constant companion. I placed a mug in the sink. The clink of ceramic was a sharp, foreign sound. IT was quickly swallowed by the waiting silence. I stood there for a long time, just listening, not to the hum, but to the feeling it left behind, to the feeling of being watched, to the feeling of being known, to the feeling that I was no longer alone in this empty space. And in a strange way, it was a comfort.